thank you all so much for joining us for our July Prop Day featuring Dr. Anita Morgan. Prop Day has a long history at the Indianapolis Propylaeum. The event is held the third Wednesday of each month, and the program features a speaker and luncheon in the club room here at the Prop. And we hope that you'll all join us at the Propylaeum when we're able to do this again in person. The Propylaeum was founded in 1888 by renowned suffragist and activist May Wright Sewell as a place where women and women's groups could meet and share ideas. We carry on that tradition today through our mission as the place that connects and celebrates women. Throughout 2020, we've planned programs and performances to commemorate the centennial of women's suffrage. And now through the end of the year, our programming will all be virtual. As a nonprofit, we count on your support to provide engaging programs like our Prop Day today with Dr. Morgan. Please take a look at our website, www.thepropylaeum.org, for all of our upcoming virtual events and to support the Prop, because we do need your support like any other nonprofit. We'd like to thank Indiana Humanities for their support of our program today with Dr. Morgan. Dr. Morgan is a senior lecturer of history at IUPUI, where she's taught since 1997. A native Hoosier and farm owner, Anita's research includes all aspects of Indiana history with a focus on women, the Civil War, and Indianapolis history. Her new book, We Must Be Fearless, The Women's Suffrage Movement in Indiana, was published by the Indiana Historical Society Press just this year in 2020. Her work has appeared in the Indiana Magazine of History, Traces of Indiana in Midwestern History, and other publications. She's held various offices, including president in the Indiana Association of Historians. When she's not searching for more information about Indiana women, Dr. Morgan likes to explore the state's antique shops and visit small diners in search of the perfect breaded tenderloin. And we hope she'll be able to do that again very soon. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Dr. Morgan.
Thank you. I just love the fact that you mentioned the tenderloin. It does make me really wish this was over so we could go out and hit the road again. But this is the next best thing I get to share with people here, and so that's really good. Thank you for asking me here today. Thank you to everybody who's here. I see a lot of names showing up on the participant list here on the edge of my screen. Some people I haven't seen for a while, but would really like to. So I'm really glad you're here today. I see some former students on there. It's nice to see you all. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to start out with essentially a talk about the adoption of the automobile in mass rallies as a way to promote suffrage. And I'm going to read a little bit at first because I'm a little rusty at this, so you're going to have to bear with me through this, and then we'll open it up to questions. And if I can figure this out, I will share photos with the share screen function. I need to start doing that. I practiced a minute ago and Liz said I did it well, so we're going to try again to see if I can do it. Okay, let's start. Today I want to focus on technology. Right now, for better or for worse, we are adapting to using technology more than most of us have done before, including Zoom and Skype for meetings like this one. Teachers are teaching online more than ever before, whether they like it or not, and I'm in that situation, and I'm a not, but I do it, and I can make it work. But technology, let's face it, can be useful. For adopting social media to support social movements and for promoting the suffrage centennial, which without Zoom we would not be doing right now. We have to admit that technology adds a lot to our lives. On a personal experience, I've recently also ventured into Twitter, which was new to me. And it was a little scary at first. That's a little bit more pressure on Twitter than there is on Facebook. But I've learned to use it. And what's really nice about Twitter is I've met historians from all over the country who also do suffrage research. So technology can be really useful. For suffragists, though, it was the adoption of the car for their endeavors that made them reach Hoosiers that they never could have probably reached before. And so that was their major technology leap at the time. They were savvy enough to combine that with extensive newspaper coverage, especially photos. They suddenly, starting in about 1912, became more recognized both personally and through their rallies and their auto tours than they ever had been before. The newspapers really got into this. Unfortunately for us, there aren't a lot of photos, good photos of suffragists on their auto tours and doing their rallies. The ones that do exist, I've included in the book, but many of those have been lost. But it's really nice to see that both, especially from Indianapolis, the News and the Star had extensive coverage of the suffrage movement. One of my favorite sentences from all the coverage of the suffrage movement is from this first auto tour that I will talk about today. And I just want to read the line because it's really amazing. 5 prominent local suffragists wooed Nora, stormed Carmel, showed Westfield the sun of political equality rising in the East, and splintered their verbal swords, maces, spears, and daggers against 2 club closing days and a bridge party at Noblesville. Now, how could you not want to read the rest of the story after you've read that? That makes suffragists sound like they're really out on a crusade. So the newspaper, the photos, and the reporting really helped too. So what pushed suffragists into this wholesale acceptance of the automobile? Well, the incentive was Governor Thomas Marshall and his proposed new state constitution. Marshall wanted only, and this is the quote, literate male citizens of the United States who were registered in the state and had paid a poll tax for 2 years to be the state's voters. Suffragists had to prevent this if they hoped to ever vote based on state and not federal laws. So after 61 years of petitioning state legislators to enact laws that recognize women's right to vote with really no success, the 2 largest suffrage groups in the state, the Women's Franchise League and the Equal Suffrage Association, decided to take their arguments directly to the people and quickly adopted new ways to travel, as well as creating large rallies to spread their message. Suffragists wanted to arouse public support and hope that the public would in turn pressure their legislators to enact suffrage laws or at least prevent the adoption of the Marshall Constitution. Both groups needed to garner enough support over the summer of 1912. While travel is good, because remember, roads are not that great in the state in 1912, they wanted that support during the summer so that when the legislature started to meet in 1913 in January, they would have the pressure from the constituents to vote against the Constitution. The first group to enter the fray with this was the Equal Suffrage Association. And I would like to thank Jill Weiss Simmons, who I think is here today, for bringing some of this information to light. If you've ever read the Indiana Historical Bureau blogs, Jill writes some really good stuff. So anyway, in 1912, the Equal Suffrage Association decided that they would use a hot air balloon in order to get the word out about suffrage. Now, hot air balloons have been around since 1783, but using them for a publicity stunt was, I think, new to Indiana. At least I haven't found any other records of one. Dr. Hannah Graham, the president of the Indianapolis branch of the ESA, arranged for suffrage buttons to be dropped from a hot air balloon as it drifted over Indianapolis. A caravan of cars would follow the balloon, and Dr. Graham said this was in order to have medical supplies around as well, I guess, in case if there was an accident. And that the caravan would also then draw attention to a suffrage meeting that was to be held later that day, just in case buttons falling from the air in a hot air balloon didn't draw attention to the right message, I suppose. The use of a hot air balloon to support suffrage had been attempted in Australia before, and the balloon had been blown off course, so it didn't quite work as they wanted. But we don't know if the Hoosier women knew that this had been done before. Unfortunately, the balloon stunt did actually not take place. The weather was windy and rainy, and it was just not the best sort of day for a balloon to drift across Indianapolis. Still, the Equal Suffrage Association did not stop trying air transportation. They had their annual meeting that June in Logansport, and they arranged for an airplane to drop leaflets around Logansport to draw interest in what was going on there. The Equal Suffrage Association estimates that about 50,000 people watched the suffrage parade in Logansport that day, although that's their estimate, and I have not been able to find any newspapers to corroborate that estimate. Later on, several years later, suffragists in Fort Wayne arranged to have flyers dropped from an airplane to celebrate the passage of the 19th Amendment in August of 1920. So they didn't give up on the plane stunts entirely. The Women's Franchise League, the other major suffrage group, stayed closer to the ground for their publicity push to block Marshall's Constitution. Drawing on successful efforts by Wisconsin suffragists for inspiration, they opted for an automobile tour to spread the word. Sarah Lauder offered the use of her car for the occasion, and I have been asked several times, do I know the make of the Lauder car? And I do not. I would love to know. If you look at my book on page 109, you will see the photo of the car, and if you ever find out what that is, I would really like to know. So Lauder offered the use of her car, and on June 5, Lauder and 4 other suffragists fastened a yellow "Votes for Banner" sign to the side of the car, loaded flyers and themselves into it, and left Indianapolis at 9:30 in the morning. And they did not say, but my suspicion is that they took a reporter with them, because this was extensively covered in both the News and the Star. Traveling north, they left some of the flyers behind in Nora, and then they motored on to Westfield. A group of men and women suffragists hosted the travelers at the public library, which is actually a building still on Main Street there, where everyone enjoyed lunch, and the Indianapolis women gave short talks about how women voters can improve the lives of mothers, working women, and really just about everything. The enthusiastic Westfield women even offered to travel to the small village of Carmel, just 3 or 4 miles to the south, to establish a branch league there. When the Indianapolis suffragists returned to their car to take their message to Noblesville, children had decorated it with peonies and roses and lilac, so it was really quite a spectacle that happened that day. The Noblesville visit, however, did not go as planned. The suffragists had chosen a really inconvenient day for their visit. Women's clubs, and there were lots of women's clubs around in Indiana at this time, women's clubs did not meet in the summer, and June 5 was the last meeting day of the year for 2 Noblesville clubs. The final day of the club season was a highlight of the year. There was usually a special program, elections, and all of this. And so you couldn't miss the last day of the club year, not even for a suffrage auto tour. Disappointed with the small number of women who met them for the meeting at the First Presbyterian Church, but understanding, because they were also club women, the importance of the last day of the club year, suffragists made the best of a bad situation. Grace Julian Clark and Sarah Lauder took to the streets to hand out suffrage flyers and talk to unsuspecting shoppers and business owners all around the courthouse square. At the end of the day, the suffragists headed south to Allisonville, distributed more flyers, and returned to Indianapolis by 5 and declared that this was a good day's work. And every time I read this, I can't help but realize this was June when they were doing this, and this was a big touring auto. This was not a little Model T that was enclosed. This is a car where you put the top down, you fasten on banners, and you make a big splash of riding through town for suffrage. And personally, physically, I couldn't have done that, because as you can tell from my voice, I'm having allergy problems right now. And you know, June is allergy season. The roads are dusty, the roads are dirty, they're not paved like they were today. So this was not only a publicity fee, I mean, this was physically hard on these women to go out and do these auto tours. So I'm glad they, you know, had a great day, but it couldn't have been an easy thing to do. Motivated by their warm reception in Westfield and undaunted by the problems at Noblesville, suffragists chose Boone County as their next destination and went to Zionsville and Lebanon the following week. The Reverend G.W. Nutter hosted the suffrage meeting at the Zionsville Christian Church. He announced his support for women voting and asked to be allowed to join the group. As what has happened in Westfield, other men also attended the meeting and displayed as much support for the cause as women. And another aside is, I've been asked a lot, how did male ministers feel about the suffrage movement? And I have yet to find an instance, although I'm sure there's one out there, of a male minister having problems with opening their churches to suffragists for their meetings there. So the Presbyterian Church and the Zionsville Christian Church are not unusual in opening their doors. Leaving behind suffrage flyers in Zionsville, the women trekked to the courthouse in Lebanon for the next meeting. This time, suffragist Mary Winter stressed that women voters could bring about the introduction of new legislation that dealt with working conditions and wages, liquor legislation, and vice regulation. She noted that women who worked in factories realized the need for the ballot more than women who did not work outside the home. She hoped that those two groups would join forces and improve working and living conditions for everyone. As with Zionsville, while the crowd expressed an interest in the cause, Boone County residents did not create a new suffrage organization that day. And these kinds of auto tours, these are the two big ones that came out of Indianapolis, but there were smaller ones across the state as well. In the end, Marshall did not get his new state constitution. He instead joined the ticket of the Democratic presidential candidate, Woodrow Wilson, and as a result of the November 1912 election, became Vice President of the United States. No suffrage legislation passed out of the 1913 General Assembly in Indiana. Despite that setback, the automobile became an essential way for suffragists to tour the state and also to use for street meetings and parades. What might have been the first Indiana suffrage street meeting took place on May 2nd, 1914, which was a day that the National American Woman Suffrage Association had designated as Women's Independence Day. Parades and meetings were held throughout the state and throughout the nation. You can find these in the newspapers. And in Indianapolis, suffragists staged a street meeting on Market Street between Illinois and Monument Circle and stood in a car as their platform, which is one of the things these cars are wonderful for. These are big cars, and a woman can stand up in those and you can be seen by a crowd. They used that as a platform, and they delivered a suffrage address and a song to an estimated 300 people. And I'm going to try this little trick here of sharing my screen. So if you'll hang on with me a minute, let's see what happens. And I hope you all can see that. My guess is that you can. Somebody will, I'm sure, let me know if not. And you can see the car here that's open. You can see, again, it's one of the big touring cars. And there are both men and women in the crowd there. Okay. In 1916, the Congressional Union, which is the forerunner of the Women's Party, which is the group that you can associate with picketing at the White House in Washington, D.C. The Congressional Union held regular street meetings in Indianapolis that summer, apparently some with cars and some without cars. And they had a regular schedule. At noon, they met at the corner of Senate and Washington Streets, and in the evenings at the corner of Market and Illinois. And if you know Indianapolis, you'll know that meeting at the corner of Market and Illinois Street is going to put you in the vicinity of the interurban terminal. So that, in other words, they strategically placed this where a lot of people would be coming and going out of Indianapolis for work or shopping, and they would be sure to be seen. And of course, Senate and Washington Streets is again close to the Capitol building, and so of course you'll draw a crowd there as well from shoppers and state workers. The use of cars expanded beyond street meetings that summer, also by the Congressional Union, into a large parade of 50 cars decorated with suffrage banners, also in June of 1916. The street meetings found their way to other towns as well. We know that the Congressional Union was at Richmond, Indiana, also that summer, and held a large meeting at the corner of 9th and Main there. Back in Indianapolis for a minute, when Republican presidential candidate Charles Evans Hughes came to town that September, suffragists again took to the streets in their cars and created a long parade through downtown Indianapolis that ended with a rally inside Tomlinson Hall. They had also conducted a auto tour to get women interested in voting in the summer of 1916. And so the summer of 1916 is really the birth of the mass rally and the car tour. And let's see if I can share the screen again. Maybe not. Here we go. This is from the big rally in 1916 for Hughes. And again, no idea what kind of car that is. It might be easier to find out though, because this car actually belongs to Charles W. Fairbanks. So if you know the Fairbanks records, maybe you can find out what kind of car he has. The other thing I want to share, and this is the big rally that took place in Tomlinson Hall, and up in the balcony, you can see that's all suffragists. The newspaper carried an item about how the suffragists loudly came in and took their place that day. Okay, I hope you got to see that. When the 1917 legislative session began, women again took to their cars and also to the inner urban to get to Indianapolis for a full court press lobby in Indianapolis during that legislative session. The legislature responded to all of this with the passage of 3 separate suffrage bills, including one for a September election for delegates to a constitutional convention. And since they had also awarded women partial suffrage that session, that meant that women would actually be able to vote for the delegates for that constitutional convention. And of course, they really wanted to do that because they wanted to be sure that the people at the convention were in favor of women's suffrage. That meant that in the summer, women had to quickly register to vote, and they had to find out how to vote, and they had to know that they could vote. So once again, suffragists took to their automobiles. A fun example of this is a 25-car caravan. They had started in Plymouth in Marshall County and traveled to several small villages and towns throughout Marshall County and the northern part of the state. The major speaker of that particular caravan was Mabel Curry of Terre Haute. And in fact, it's Mabel Curry is the person from whom I get the title of the book, We Must Be Fearless. That was her phrase. At one point, Curry, during this auto tour, stood in the rain on a chair to address a crowd of 200 to inform them that they could vote and they needed to register to vote. In Miami County, which is where Peru is, what they called a flying squadron of cars went on a 2-day registration drive. And these registration drives took place in all parts of the state, and they could reach the small villages and towns that were not near a rail line. And because roads in Indiana were still not that good at this time, it really did take persistence to get 2 women on the farms and in the small villages to let them know that they could register and they could vote. Sometimes they took notaries with them so that the women could fill out the registration forms in their homes, and then they would be taken back so that women could vote. It's through this extensive effort that literally tens of thousands of women in Indiana registered to vote that summer and proved false the accusation of anti-suffragists that women didn't really want to vote anyway. The numbers proved them wrong. Women beyond suffrage also used the automobiles to help support the First World War. The car came in handy as many suffragists signed on to be 14-minute women to work with the State Council of Defense. The 14-minute women was actually a creation of a suffragist who had connections to suffragists all over the state and said, hey, I have these connections, State Council of Defense, would you like for us to go out and rally support for the war effort? And they were told yes. So suffragists set out throughout the state not only to talk about voting, but to talk about supporting the war effort as well. So some suffragists also joined the Motor Corps, which is complete with uniforms, and women drove military officials and other officials around the state who were conducting whatever war business they had to attend to. They also used their cars in the summer of 19 for another suffrage petition drive. The final way that women used cars in Indiana was, of course, on November 2nd, 1920, which was the first day they could vote. Suffragists provided transportation to the polls throughout the day. If you had a car and you belonged to a suffrage group, you were more than likely pressed into service to make sure that you could take women from their homes to the polls and back again, and basically ran a taxi service that day to make it easy for women to get to the polls. It was cold that day, by the way. And so if you're an older woman and you wanted to vote, it might be nice to have somebody help chauffeur you there. The last thing I want to mention, and this may be cutting off a question, but I'll mention it now anyway, is that what about Black suffragists? There were African-American suffragists throughout the state. Did they participate in the auto tours, the rallies, the mass meetings? And that question is not really easy to answer. The first African-American suffrage group in Indianapolis was formed in that summer of 1912 when everyone was worried about the Marshall Constitution. And it was formed with the help of the Equal Suffrage Association. Black women's clubs had, of course, existed prior to this. They were formed in the late 19th century, the same time as white women's clubs. But this group in 1912 is the first mention of a group that was devoted completely to suffrage. This idea of suffrage clubs in Indianapolis amongst Black women caught on quickly. And by the time we get to 1914, 200 African-American suffragists are holding a meeting at the Senate Avenue YMCA in Indianapolis. They also held rallies at the Second Christian Church, and you'll see this ubiquitous in the Indianapolis paper, suffrage rallies at the Second Christian Church. Also at other African-American churches around Indianapolis, including Bethel AME and Mount Zion churches. The speaker was usually either Carrie Barnes, later Carrie Barnes Ross, which if you've seen the suffrage publicity, you've seen her photo, and also Frances Berry Costin. Both were well-known public school teachers, and they spoke to suffrage groups throughout Indianapolis. And Barnes actually attended a mass rally that included labor union leaders and socialists, and Hannah Graham of the ESL, and she spoke to that rally as well. But other than those specific instances, it's really difficult to know if there were any rallies outside of churches. My gut is, other than the few I just mentioned, my gut feeling is most of them took place inside the churches, as the African-American churches were very welcome to women's suffrage rallies. We don't know if that large parade in 1916 for Charles Evans Hughes included African-American suffragists, although the newspaper referred to women from all walks of life taking place in the proceedings. And sometimes the newspapers will use phrases like that when they're referring to working class women or Black women participating in causes. And so we can't really know from there. But to conclude, automobiles were incredibly important. I would argue they're still very important today. Automobiles allowed suffragists in the early 20th century to be persistent. And if we learn anything from the Indiana suffrage movement, is that persistence is what will win the day. With a car, you can go to talk to people, and you can go back, and you can go back. And you can hold rallies by standing in them. They were a wonderful device and really, really helpful. And I've talked a really long time. So what I'd like to do, and I think Liz is going to help with this, is go ahead and open this up to all sorts of questions. I'm open to anything you might have to ask. Hi, Liz, you're back.
Okay, unmuted. We got a question about the cars specifically. How common was it for women to be able to drive or even own cars?
That's a great question. Everybody that I know who offered a car to do this were women who had money. Sarah Lauder's father ran a furniture factory, which is now condos down by the zoo. And so it's not too surprising that Lauder had a car and she was able to take them around. And of course, I showed the photo of the Fairbanks automobile. So it kind of goes into that stereotype, not stereotype, that many suffragists had wealth and so had the time to do this, but they had the cars and were able to do this. And that's another reason I'm not really sure as far as African-American suffragists. I mean, there is that wonderful photo of Madam Walker in her automobile, but I don't know how many automobiles were in the area. But on the other hand, at a time when you don't really have restrictions on driving, there's not a driving test, there's not an age requirement. As long as you can reach everything, you can drive. My guess is more women adopted the automobile as quickly as possible. By 1920, automobiles were ubiquitous in the United States. So in 1912, it would have been a little unusual, but as that decade went on, more and more people would have had them.
Okay. So you did a lot of research, obviously, to write your book. How did Indiana differ for other states or from other states in women getting the right to vote?
We were different. And I think that's because we're one of the oldest states in the Midwest. And so you can't really say that there's a Midwestern way to do suffrage if you want to include Indiana in that. Other Midwestern states did not have the same large number of immigrants into the state. For example, we had a large number of, not as many as Ohio, but we had a large number of German immigrants who were very important to the state. There were free black settlements in the state from when the state began. And so that in itself gave a population of African Americans that became involved in the movement from as very early, as far as we can tell. The other thing that you find here, it's something I'm still working on finding out why, is there is this acceptance of just a lot of different people into the suffrage movement. If you want to be a suffragist, it's you can be Jewish, you can be Catholic, you can belong to any number of Protestant churches, you can be an immigrant. One of the most famous speakers in the northern part of the state was a Danish immigrant. So it's as you read more about what happened farther west, those sorts of things were not, how do I want to say this, embedded in the movement from the beginning, but it seems like they were in Indiana.
Okay, so what was Indiana's role then in the national push for women's suffrage?
We were really important, and I think it's from being that early state, heavily Quaker settled. It's the Quaker ties that really tied us at first to the national movement. You've got the large settlements by Richmond and in the east central part of the state. Dr. Mary Thomas was originally from Pennsylvania, knew Lucretia Mott really well. And so from early on, you had those ties. She knew Susan B. Anthony. As we get into the 20th century, Ida Husted Harper left Terre Haute and became the publicity guru for the National American Woman Suffrage Association. So when you look at those posters, that's a Hoosier behind those, which is really amazing and really important. And she had been doing publicity for suffrage since the end of the 19th century. She's somebody we really need to know a lot more about than what we do. And Mary Garrett Hay, of course, was essential with bringing the Republican Party around to suffrage right before suffrage, because she was chair of the National Republicans Women's Committee, which is a really big deal. And so the Republicans really got behind suffrage as well.
Okay, so were we primarily more American Women's Suffrage Association or National Women's Suffrage Association? Major or minor league?
That's always a fun question. They were both. Which I think is why when the two organizations merge in 1890, we have women who were on the national committees of both of those groups who worked together to merge the groups into one. And they had seen the writing on the wall in Indiana, and they had already merged the Indiana groups prior to this. Now, it wasn't easy to merge because you have strong personalities working on this. And it took a couple of years to negotiate all of the various ways this was going to happen, both in the state and nationally. But we tended in the leadership to go with the American Woman Suffrage Association, but there was a strong contingent with the National Woman Suffrage Association. So in the end, they realized it was better to be one group than two.
Yeah. So are there lessons from the movement, from the women's suffrage movement around coalition building that can apply to women today?
Wow, that's a good question. Like I just mentioned, there were really strong personalities in the women's suffrage movement. And I think one of the things we can learn is that if you want to get something done, you can't let the personalities get in the way. I mean, if we look at the 19th century, you have Helen Gauger and May Sewell basically at loggerheads the whole time. They do not get along at all, as Gauger lets the world know in a speech in Chicago. And it's really unfortunate because they're two wonderful minds that were good in their respective. One was really good in organization and the other one was really good at talking. And just think of what could have happened if the two of them had cooperated. That would have been really helpful. And when you get in the 20th century, you have Dr. Amelia Keller and Dr. Hannah Graham, who don't get along. They don't necessarily like each other. And so for years, they try to merge the Women's Franchise League and the Equal Suffrage Association, and they just can't quite get it done, which means that the ESA eventually just kind of peters out and goes away. But it would have been really nice if they had realized that maybe suffrage was bigger personal difficulties. And I would also say, and this is a long answer and then I'll be quiet, but the other thing I would say is that you have to give Indiana credit for their work with, as I mentioned earlier, immigrant women, but also with Black suffragists. There is a lot of joint effort going on between white and Black suffrage clubs. And I think a lot of that is built on personal relationships, and that, I mean, we're finding out more this year as new books come out about relationships between African American and white suffragists, but yeah, I haven't seen the personal close ties we have here in Indiana.
Yeah. Okay, we have another question. And was Mayorite Sewell, did she participate in the car tours?
No, she did not. She was off busy doing other things.
Okay.
At that point, and she wasn't even in Indiana for a lot of that time. Yeah. So she did not. That would have been, I don't know. I had trouble picturing her on a dusty, dirty road in a car with that banner. Maybe she would have, but I think she would have been the person behind the scenes saying, "This is where you need to go. Go here." Yeah. She's the organizer.
Yeah. So you've touched on the research that you've done. Can you talk about what information is there for? I mean, it just has to be difficult researching, women suffragists in Indiana, and even more difficult researching African American women that were part of the movement. Where were you able to find any information, and what other types of information are you looking for?
Oh, that's a great question. It's hard. And of course, then COVID hit, and that kind of shut all the further research down. The book wouldn't have come out if I had dug as deep as I needed to for the book to get that out there. A lot of the information has to come from the Indianapolis newspapers, and specifically the News and the Star, because they have a lot of information. They have columns that are unfortunately entitled News of Colored Folks. But you can find a lot of information about suffrage club meetings, what's going on in churches, things like that. Unfortunately, between 1916 and 1926, the newspaper that would tell us the most, which is the Indianapolis Recorder, was published, but those newspapers no longer exist. The Recorder prior to 1916 is a wealth of information. And one of the biggest things, I mean, I work at IUPUI, and for years we've been trying to find what happened to those issues of the Recorder. Where are they? Where did they disappear to? I even asked a reporter from the Recorder last year. I said, "Do you guys have the back issues?" And nobody does, but it would be really stellar if we had those. The other place to look, and again, this got shut down when COVID hit, would be the churches. Some of the churches that I've contacted for records, well, unfortunately, the Second Christian Church no longer exists as the Second Christian Church. It's now Word of Light, I believe it is. I would have to look that up. Another church I contacted, some of their records were lost when their basement flooded. And so which is, I know it's tragic. Never put records in your basement. So that was a problem. But there are other places where you can find. I'm not giving up. The other thing, and I just found this, and for those of you who follow me on Twitter, you've seen this. I'm looking at Frances Berry Costin right now, and her great-granddaughter just tweeted at me and said, "Oh my gosh, you're looking at my grandmother," which I'm very excited. I'm trying to get in contact with her. But Frances Berry Costin published editorials as an African-American school teacher in the Indianapolis News about voting. And I have been looking at her editorials to try to see what her mindset is about this. And she worked for the News for years. She later wrote book reviews for the Indianapolis News. So I'm trying to use those as kind of a inside view to see if I can figure out what's going on in the community. But it's really hard, but it's totally worth the effort. The other thing that's really nice is there was a group at Muncie who left minutes behind of their meetings, and so I've been looking at those as well. But you just have to find little things here and there.
Okay. While we're talking about lost research, lost information. Can you talk about the voting statistics from from 1920? How many women voted? When we find a chance.
That's so frustrating. That's another thing. Indiana is such an interesting state, and it's so frustrating sometimes to not have these records. I've been in touch with the state archives, and they've sent me a list of what they have, and I have, of course, we shut down. I haven't been able to see those, obviously. But again, most of what we have to go through are newspapers. But if anybody is on this today, and you know where polling books are for 1920, that would be golden. Please let me know. Let Liz know. Let somebody know, please, where those are, because we would like to know. The myth is women didn't vote once they got the vote. Okay. Not true for Indiana. If you look at the newspapers, Marion County estimated that or the Star estimated that on November 2nd, 1920, less than 5,000 of the 76,000 women who were registered to vote in that election did not vote. So a large majority, and the newspapers are filled with women are the first in line. Women are there. They're standing out in the cold. They bring their kids and stand out in the cold. They're voting in large numbers. Warsaw, Indiana recorded on that day that nearly 100% of the women who had registered. Where else? There was one other town that had that as well. Tipton also had a really good turnout. And so and South Bend. South Bend said the same thing. Almost 40,000 women registered to vote, and almost all of them voted. So there was a really heavy turnout if you look at newspapers. But of course, as a historian, I would like to have another source to back that up. But as you read returns throughout the state, women had a heavy turnout. They came out early. They were the first ones in line. They voted early. They were pretty much done by noon. So that would be great. And we know that happened in the African-American communities as well. They turned out in large numbers and they voted.
So we have a couple of questions about specific churches. Did the AME Church in Indy have any records of women's meetings? And also there was a question about the Crooked Creek Baptist Church at Kessler in Michigan, if you're familiar. I
have not seen the name Crooked Creek. I think I would remember that, and I have not seen that. The Bethel Church, they did have meetings from time to time. I think most of the meetings took place at Second Christian, because their minister was very involved in social movements in Indianapolis and the Black community at that time. And so I think they gravitated towards that particular church.
Okay. Changing subjects, can you talk a little bit about the women that were anti-suffrage?
Okay. I can do that.
Or two on that.
I can do that. Now, what's fun is that they were not a big group in Indiana, or at least they didn't make a big splash. And when they tried, they didn't do it very well. So there's that. In 1917, when it looked for certain that Indiana women were going to get some sort of vote, and of course they did, that legislative session, 3 laws were passed. There was a letter from 19 women published in the Indianapolis newspaper who were anti-suffrage. And they said that this minority of women who wanted the vote should not force the majority of women in Indiana to vote. That was not right. That women could do more good without the ballot than they could with the ballot. They could be the behind the scenes pressure, if you will. And most of these women were from the north side, Delaware Street, Meridian Street, Pennsylvania Street, not too far north. And they had been visited, we find out, by a member of the national anti-suffrage group, who had decided to come and form a group in Indianapolis to rally against that. And this is really the first you see anybody really coming out anti-suffrage, at least that I've been able to see in the newspapers in Indiana. And they forced a hearing at the State House to argue that women did not really want the vote. And they even brought in a man from Iowa who led the men's anti-suffrage national organization. So they had members of national organizations there against suffrage at this hearing, and suffragists knew it was going to happen. And so they just did the only thing they knew to do. They packed the hearing with suffragists. So there are this small group of anti-suffragists and pro-suffragists who are applauding every time somebody says something good about suffrage, and they basically take over the meeting. But that was really the extent of anti-suffrage work in the state. I haven't been able to, I'm sure there were other people who didn't agree, but the documents aren't there, even for the 19th century. I haven't found them.
Okay. Were any women in Indiana arrested that you're aware of for protesting?
Actually, yes, one. And she's in the book. That we did have one suffragist. Her last name was Barnes, and there are two Barneses, and I can't remember unless I grab my book real quick and find out which Barnes she was, who picketed the White House.
Okay.
So she was actually there, and she was arrested, and she was put in jail in DC. And we don't really know what happened to her, because when she was immediately released, she met with a reporter and said how horrible it was, and she felt duped, like the National Women's Party had led her on, and this was a stupid thing to do. But then when she got back to Indianapolis, she was like, "Oh, it was a great thing to do. I'm really glad I did this." So we don't know how she really felt about it, but she's the only one that I know of.
Okay, all right. And another question from a participant: what role did socialism play, or the Socialist Party?
Well, that's a good question, because I'm pretty sure Mabel Curry was a socialist. Where the title of the book comes from is a socialist. She was a good friend of Eugene and Kate Debs. Some say more than a friend with Eugene, but we don't know that. The Eugene Debs house would say no, so I don't really know. But definitely Dr. Graham and the Equal Suffrage Association worked with socialists. You'll see Dr. Graham going out and working with labor unions and socialists. You'll see Carrie Barnes, the African-American suffragist, speak at a rally that included an African-American candidate for a state geologist position, for example. He was a socialist. And so they will basically, it seems, work with anyone who says, yes, I will support suffrage.
Yeah, yeah. And then because I'm here at the Propylaeum, and you should be here at the Propylaeum. Can you talk just a minute about May? Can you just talk about May for a second?
I sure can. I like to talk about May. So underrated for the work that she did, especially at the national level and the international level. She did some work at the state level, but I think her ideas could not be contained within the state. She was a really big thinker. She was like, yes, I want to organize the state, but I want to organize the country. And I want to have a National Women's Council, and we're going to talk about these things. And if we have a national council, we should have an international council. And she was just such a master organizer that I think it was Stanton and Anthony spoke to her about both, and they just basically gave her her head and said, fine, go do this, because it seems like you can. And she did. But what's unfortunate is she doesn't get as much credit for doing both of those things as she really deserves. Other people who I think were more publicity savvy kind of swooped in and took some of the credit for what she did. And I think part of what I hope the book will do and the Propylaeum will do is kind of restore her, and Ray's book will do. And I know Ray's been writing about her some more. Hi, Ray, I know you're on here somewhere. That they put her back where she belongs, and not just be May Sewell from Indiana, who Helen Gauger yelled at the World's Fair in Chicago, but that she gets the credit. There are all these pictures of her doing these international things, and some of her papers about it are actually at the Indianapolis Public Library. But you could not contain her within Indiana, is my impression. Yeah. She was too big for us.
We think that. We think she was important. We find it. So what, did you find anything that really surprised you in all of your research? What surprised you about suffrage in Indiana?
Wow, that's a good question. Everything. Well, we have this stereotype of Indianapolis suffragists as these very wealthy white women who had nothing else to do and gave little teas and, you know, talked to their husband's friends and said, how about giving us the vote? That's the stereo, and it's not that at all. Very independent-minded, headstrong women with a goal who went out and did what, and I headstrong in a good way, did what they wanted to do. And the friendships between what have to be friendships between the white suffragists and the African-American suffragists. They go to each other's meetings, they visit, they teach school. They know each other well. You can tell. There's an integrated suffrage club in Terre Haute. There's a suffrage club in Peru, Indiana, that is not only African-American white, but also has at least one Native American Indian in it. I think, quite frankly, I was so, as somebody who grew up in Indiana, was so influenced by Indiana and the Klan that this inner working of these groups was something I didn't imagine had ever happened, but it did. And so that was probably, for me, one of the most surprising and, quite frankly, happy. That I found. I mean, that was like, okay, so why don't we know this? And we should know this. So I'm happy I got to write the book, if for no other reason than that. There's so much that still needs to be done. The other thing, and this is just the other thing, I did not realize how many women of the Jewish faith were involved in the suffrage movement in Indiana either. Local offices, state offices, also within the General Federation of Clubs. Again, if you see me on Twitter, I'm trying to look at Bertha Bourne and Sarah Messing Stern right now, and their incredible work that they did throughout the state. As well. I think a lot of Indiana suffrage is personal relationships. I think that's they like each other, they know each other, they know how to work together. I wish we had more personal letters to verify that, but there seems to be, in what I have found, an ease of working together, which I think is nice.
Yeah. So what do you say to someone? What do you say to a woman that says she's not going to vote?
Oh my God. Well, first I say that. What do you mean you're not going to vote? You have to vote. Don't let May Wright Sewell turn in her grave, please. You have to go vote. The poor woman. No, there's. I always personally, I think voting is incredibly important. That was driven home to me when I was 18, and the first election that I could vote, I screwed up the absentee ballot because I was in college and I messed it up. And when my mom went to vote, because I'm from a really small little village, the person at the polling book said, "Oh, look, Anita didn't vote. Do you know why she hasn't come to vote?" And my mother was horrified because it was right there that I had not voted. And I had classes and I couldn't vote. And I was raked over the coals for that, and rightly so, that I had not paid enough attention in order to vote. But I think I always consider voting to be more as a duty. This is not a right or a privilege, it's a duty. This is what you do. You live here, you must participate in this. And so, I mean, I give this little speech in my classes, quite frankly, around election day. This is what you must do. You live here. You must participate in the government that you have. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. So what's next for you? What are you doing next?
Wow.
What's your next book?
I have about 3 in my head, quite frankly. There's one thing I would love to do, and it wouldn't be just me, this would be a joint effort, which I think would be appropriate because the Indiana suffrage movement was a joint effort, is I would like to see a book with each chapter have a biography about some of these wonderful women. Because we need to know, you can find yourself in these suffragists if you know enough of them. You can say, oh, that's me, I did that, that's my process of getting there. I would love to see a book like that and have it be like my current book, a popular history that's accessible to everybody, not an academic book per se, but a popular history. I would love to do that. I don't think Jackie Swihart is on here today, but Jackie's been doing a lot of work on Grace Julian Clark. And if Jackie doesn't write the book on Grace Julian Clark, I may very well write a book on Grace Julian Clark. Somebody needs to. She is amazing. She is, and it would be a book about her father as well, because she was so influenced by him. But that would be really good. And then, of course, I want to do something on the 1920s and women voting in the 20s. I found a really great article on African American voting in 1924, which was the Klan election, when Republicans went Klan in Indiana and African Americans became Democratic. But it doesn't tell me enough. And so if we can find those polling books, if we can find more information, that there's a whole something there as well. So yeah, I have a lot of projects in my head.
Okay, good. Well, we anticipate you getting right on those. So again, Anita's book, We Must Be Fearless, the women's suffrage movement in Indiana. And where can people get this, Anita?
At the Indiana Historical Society. You can go online. I think I can't remember if, it's online through their bookstore. And I can't remember I don't know if there's anybody from the Indiana Historical Society on here. If you want to type in chat what the URL is, but you can get it through them. You can also get it through Amazon, but get it through the Indiana Historical Society. That's who you should get it from. We're open.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It really is insightful, and we appreciate your taking the time. And one day we're all going to be able to come back here, and we'll talk again. We'll have you back.
Good, that would be great. Maybe I'll have more information by then.
Or your next book.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Anita, thank you so much for participating, and thank you all for joining us today. Thanks.
Thank you.